Murder in the Lab. The rain beat down heavily on the old brick building that housed Dr. Robert Ellington's laboratory, a sanctuary of science tucked away in a remote part of the city. Within its thick walls, the world was oblivious to the revolutionary work that was taking place. To the outside world, Dr. Robert was just another scientist, brilliant, yes, but still bound by the limits of human potential. Little did anyone know that behind those locked doors, Robert was on the brink of discovering something that could alter the course of human history. He was about to crack the secret to immortality. Immortality, Robert whispered to himself, the word lingering on his lips like a prayer. The thought had consumed him for years, an idea that had started as a mere scientific curiosity and grown into a relentless obsession. What if death could be defeated? What if time no longer had power over us? But for Robert, this was more than just a theoretical exercise. It was personal. In the quiet, dimly lit lab, the ticking of the clock was the only sound that accompanied Robert's frantic scribbling on a whiteboard. Equations, chemical structures, and scientific theories were scrawled across its surface in a chaotic yet somehow elegant mess. It had been weeks since he'd had a proper night's sleep, but the exhaustion was a small price to pay. He was so close he could practically feel it. Just a few more adjustments, he muttered, barely noticing the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His hands were steady, despite the fatigue that gnawed at his body. Every nerve in his system was alive with the possibility of success. Behind this relentless drive was a tragedy that haunted him every waking moment. His daughter, Emily, had passed away years ago due to an aggressive illness that modern medicine couldn't cure. Robert had been helpless, watching as time slipped through his fingers, unable to save her. It was that moment, standing by her hospital bed, that the seed had been planted in his mind. What if death was just another disease? One that could be cured? That thought had driven him ever since. He had sworn that no one else would have to experience the pain of losing a loved one. He would give the world a gift that no one had dared to imagine, a medicine that could stop aging, heal any ailment, and extend life indefinitely. And he was so close. Dr. Robert's research was the culmination of decades of study in biochemistry, genetics, and regenerative medicine. He had pored over ancient texts, consulted with specialists, and even delved into the darkest corners of theoretical biology. His breakthrough had come when he discovered a rare enzyme in a species of deep-sea jellyfish, an enzyme capable of reversing cellular decay. If these creatures can essentially live forever, Robert had said during one of his late-night conversations with his research notes, then why can't we harness that same power for humans? But it wasn't just about reversing aging. Dr. Robert's serum was designed to repair damaged DNA, regenerate cells, and even boost the immune system to an almost superhuman level. It was nothing short of a miracle drug, a key to eternal youth. As he carefully handled a glowing vial of the serum, he couldn't help but marvel at the possibilities. The end of cancer, Alzheimer's, heart disease, all of it could be eradicated, he murmured, eyes gleaming with the kind of fervor that only a scientist on the brink of a breakthrough could possess. But this kind of research didn't come without risks. Robert had isolated himself from his colleagues, cut off ties with old friends, and even distanced himself from his wife, Emma. It was just too dangerous to let anyone in. In the sterile silence of his lab, surrounded by shelves filled with chemical compounds and experimental data, Robert worked tirelessly. The walls were his only companions, a silent testament to the price he had paid for his pursuit of immortality. One evening, as he was engrossed in his work, the door to the lab creaked open. It was Emma, bringing him a tray with dinner. "Robert, you've barely eaten," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern. She placed the tray on a cluttered table, pushing aside some vials to make space. "I'm fine, Emma," Robert replied curtly, not looking up from his notes. "I'm on the verge of something extraordinary. I can't stop now." Emma sighed, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and worry. "You've been saying that for months. Whatever it is you're working on, it's consuming you." I barely see you anymore. Robert finally looked up, his eyes shining with an intensity that almost frightened her. Emma, if I succeed, no one will ever have to die again. Don't you see? I could change the world. Emma shook her head. But at what cost, Robert? You're losing yourself in this obsession. He waved her concerns away, turning back to his work. You wouldn't understand, he muttered under his breath. But deep down, a small part of him wondered if she was right. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, his diet consisted of cold coffee and granola bars, and his once steady hands now shook with the weight of exhaustion. But none of that mattered. He was too close to the answer. The breakthrough finally came in the dead of night. Robert was hunched over his desk, eyes bloodshot, hands stained with the chemicals he had been experimenting with. The lab was filled with the acrid smell of burning metal and chemicals, a testament to the countless failed attempts he had endured. But this time, the formula in front of him was different. Come on, he whispered, watching the solution in the test tube. A soft, almost imperceptible glow began to emanate from the liquid, growing brighter with each passing second. His heart pounded. Could this be it? Grabbing a syringe, Robert drew a small amount of the glowing serum. He hesitated for a moment. If I test this on myself, there's no going back. But in that moment, the thought of failure, of losing everything he had worked so hard for, was far more terrifying than the unknown risks of the serum. Steeling himself, he injected the serum into his arm. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the steady hum of the machines around him and the faint sound of rain tapping against the lab windows. Then, a sensation like fire coursed through his veins. He gasped, clutching the edge of the desk for support as waves of heat and energy surged through his body. It's working, he gasped, eyes wide with exhilaration. The pain faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of vitality. He felt stronger, sharper, as if a fog had been lifted from his mind. Robert looked at his hands, amazed. The wrinkles seemed to be fading, the age spots disappearing. This is it. He exclaimed, a wild grin spreading across his face. I've done it. I've conquered death. But as quickly as the euphoria set in, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The world spun, and his vision blurred. No, this wasn't supposed to happen, he whispered, stumbling backward. He reached out to steady himself, but his legs gave way, and he crumpled to the floor. Robert lay there, gasping for breath, his vision flickering between darkness and light. Was this the price of immortality? Had he miscalculated? His mind raced with possibilities as the serum's effects began to stabilize. Slowly, his strength returned, but the experience had shaken him. I need more tests, he muttered, pulling himself up to a seated position. I can't risk this on anyone else yet. But the world was already closing in. The shadowy organizations that had long been watching his research, waiting for him to slip, had already caught wind of his breakthrough. For them, immortality wasn't a gift, it was a weapon, a tool for control. And they were willing to kill for it. Dr. Robert's discovery would not remain a secret for long. And soon, he would realize that the price of immortality was far higher than he ever imagined. The heavy rain that had started in the evening continued into the early hours of the morning, drumming against the windows of the old manor that housed Dr. Robert Ellington's secret research lab. Inside, the entire building was shrouded in darkness, save for the occasional flicker of lightning illuminating the rooms with an eerie glow. The wind howled outside, but inside, it was unsettlingly quiet. Emma Ellington, the scientist's wife, had barely slept a wink that night. It was not unusual for Dr. Robert to work late, his obsession with his research had long robbed them of their peaceful nights together. But tonight felt different. There had been a strange tension in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She tossed and turned in bed, staring at the alarm clock on her bedside table as it blinked 2:20 a.m. in angry red digits. Finally, she could take it no longer. I'll just check on him, she whispered to herself, pushing back the covers and slipping on her robe. The hallway was dim, lit only by a faint nightlight. Emma's footsteps were muffled on the thick carpet as she made her way toward Robert's lab, tucked away at the far end of the house. The closer she got, the more uneasy she felt. The silence was oppressive, almost like the house was holding its breath. "Robert?" she called softly as she reached the lab door. No answer. She frowned. Usually, she could hear the hum of machines or the clatter of glassware, but tonight there was nothing. Hesitating for a moment, Emma slowly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The sight that met her eyes made her heart stop. The lab was in disarray. Papers were scattered across the floor, glass vials lay shattered, and the desk was overturned. But it was the figure hanging from the ceiling that made her let out a blood-curdling scream. "Robert! No!" she cried, rushing forward, but her knees gave way halfway across the room. There, suspended from a thick rope, was her husband, Dr. Robert Ellington. His lifeless body swayed gently as if mocking her with every movement. For a moment, she was paralyzed by the horror of it all. Her mind raced. "This can't be happening. This can't be real, ***, she whispered to herself, choking on her own sobs. But she knew she had to act fast. There was no time to fall apart. With trembling hands, Emma fumbled for her phone. She had one number on speed dial that she had never imagined she would need to use. It was a direct line to Detective Michael Rook, a man who specialized in high-profile, sensitive cases. Years ago, Robert had insisted on getting this special hotline number, just in case his research ever attracted the wrong kind of attention. "Detective Michael, it's Emma Ellington," she stammered, barely able to get the words out between sobs. "Robert, he's dead. Please, you have to come quickly." On the other end of the line, Detective Michael's voice was calm and steady, a rock amidst the storm of her panic. "Emma, listen to me," he said firmly. "Take a deep breath. Don't touch anything. I'm on my way." Emma nodded, though he couldn't see her. Okay, just please hurry." Within 15 minutes, the sound of police sirens broke through the sound of the rain, followed by the screech of car tires. Detective Michael Rook, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a permanent frown etched into his face, stepped out of his unmarked car. His dark trench coat flapped in the wind as he made his way toward the manor's entrance. Emma met him at the door, her eyes red and swollen. "He's in the lab," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay here," Michael instructed her firmly. "I need to take a look." He moved past her, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings as he made his way toward the lab. The scene that greeted him was grim. The room was filled with the metallic smell of blood and the pungent scent of chemicals. The dim lights flickered, casting shadows that danced ominously around the room. But Michael's focus was on the lifeless figure hanging from the ceiling. For a moment, he stood there, taking in every detail, the position of the body, the angle of the rope, the disarray in the lab. His experienced eyes missed nothing. He noticed the overturned chair nearby, a detail that would suggest suicide. But something about the scene didn't sit right with him. "This doesn't look like a simple suicide," he muttered to himself. He turned to Emma, who was standing at the door, clutching her robe tightly around her. "Emma, I need you to tell me everything you saw." Emma's voice trembled as she recounted the events. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her eyes darting around the room as if she were afraid of what she might see. I came to check on him around 2:30 a.m., and I found him like this." Michael nodded, taking notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "Was anyone else in the house?" She shook her head. "No, just the staff, 3 workers. But they wouldn't dare come into the lab. Robert was very strict about that." The detective's eyes narrowed. 3 workers, you say? I'll need to speak to them. But first, Emma, was Robert working on anything controversial? Emma hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the desk where Robert kept his research notes. Yes, she admitted quietly. He was working on a secret project. A medicine that could grant immortality. Michael's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he quickly masked it. Immortality, you say? That's quite the secret to keep. Did anyone else know about it? No, Emma said quickly. At least. I don't think so. Robert was very cautious. He kept most of his work to himself. Michael turned his attention back to the lab. Something about the scene still bothered him. The rope was tied in an oddly complex knot, one that seemed too intricate for someone who was supposedly in a desperate state to end their life. He walked over to Robert's desk, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. Amidst the scattered papers, he found a small notebook with Robert's scribblings. The key to eternal life lies in the sequence, one of the entries read. Michael's brow furrowed. This wasn't the kind of thing you would expect to find in the diary of a man about to take his own life. As he moved around the room, he noticed something else, scratch marks on the floor near the electric meter by the wall. He knelt down for a closer look. What were you hiding, Robert? He muttered under his breath. Detective Michael straightened up and turned to Emma. I'll need to question the workers you mentioned, he said. But I have to be honest, Emma. This doesn't look like a straightforward suicide. There are too many loose ends. Emma's face turned pale. You think someone killed him? Michael nodded slowly, his eyes sharp and calculating. It's too early to say for sure, but it's starting to look that way. If Robert was close to perfecting a formula for immortality, that would be worth killing for, wouldn't it? Emma's eyes filled with tears. But who would do such a thing? Robert, he just wanted to help people. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll get to the bottom of this, Emma. I promise. As he began to piece together the clues, one thing became clear, Dr. Robert's death was only the beginning of a far deeper mystery. And whatever secrets he had been hiding, there were powerful people who would stop at nothing to keep those secrets buried. Detective Michael Rook stood in the dimly lit lab, the rain outside continuing to beat furiously against the windows. The scent of chemicals and something metallic lingered in the air, almost suffocating. The scene in front of him was grim. Dr. Robert Ellington's lifeless body swayed gently from the ceiling, casting a long shadow in the intermittent flashes of lightning. Michael had seen many crime scenes in his career, but something about this one felt off. It was too convenient. As if it had been set up to look like a suicide. He turned to Emma Ellington, who stood trembling near the door, her eyes red from crying. All right, Emma, Michael said gently, trying to keep his voice calm. I need you to walk me through what happened earlier tonight. Start from the beginning. Emma nodded, her hands shaking as she clutched the silk belt of her robe tighter around her waist. I brought him coffee, ***, she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. Take your time, Michael urged. He knew the best way to get the truth was to let people talk without pressure. Emma's eyes darted around the room, as if the very walls might accuse her of something. Emma took a deep, shuddering breath before continuing. Robert was working late tonight, as usual, she said. I thought a cup of coffee might help him stay focused. Michael raised an eyebrow. At 2:30 in the morning? That's quite late for coffee, isn't it? Emma flinched at the question. Yes, I suppose so. But Robert, he was always so absorbed in his work. He hardly noticed the time. She looked down at her hands, twisting the wedding ring on her finger anxiously. I just wanted to be supportive. I knew how important this project was to him. The detective's gaze remained steady. You said you found him around that time, 2:30 a.m. Can you walk me through exactly what happened after you brought him the coffee? Emma nodded slowly, her voice trembling as she relived the moment. I knocked on the lab door, but he didn't answer. That wasn't unusual, sometimes he'd be so deep in thought he wouldn't hear me. So, I let myself in. She swallowed hard, tears welling up in her eyes. That's when I saw him hanging there. Michael kept his expression neutral, though his mind was already racing through possible scenarios. So, you're saying that Robert was already dead when you entered the room? Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking. I was in shock. I couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I needed help, so I called you immediately. Michael nodded. You didn't call 911. Emma blinked in confusion. No, I didn't. I don't know why, I panicked. And Robert told me once that if anything ever happened, I should call you directly. That statement made Michael pause. He told you to call me? Why? Emma hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he said that with his research, he couldn't trust just anyone. He was worried someone might try to sabotage him. Sabotage? Michael's eyes narrowed. The plot was thickening. What exactly was Robert working on, Emma? Was it really just an immortality drug? Emma glanced at the lifeless figure of her husband, still swaying slightly in the cold air of the lab. Yes. I think so, ***, she murmured. But Robert kept many secrets, even from me. All I knew was that he was on the verge of something big, something that would change everything. Detective Michael turned his attention back to the lab. The coffee cup Emma had mentioned was nowhere to be seen. Where's the coffee you brought him, Emma? He asked, his tone sharper than before. She blinked, caught off guard. The coffee? I think it was on his desk when I found him, ***, she replied uncertainly, glancing around the room. But with everything that happened, I didn't notice if it was still there. Michael moved toward the cluttered desk. Papers were scattered everywhere, but there was no sign of any coffee cup. Are you sure you brought it in here? He pressed, crouching down to check under the desk. Emma's face turned pale. I think so, ***, she stammered, clearly confused. I remember setting it down, or maybe I didn't. I don't know, detective, I was so frightened. Michael straightened up, his eyes boring into hers. You need to be absolutely certain, Emma. Was the coffee here, or did something happen between the time you brought it and the time you found Robert? Emma's hands shook, and she looked down at the floor, tears slipping down her cheeks. I don't know, ***, she whispered. I was just trying to help him, but now I'm so confused. Michael's instincts were tingling. The details didn't quite line up. If Emma had brought the coffee at 2:30 a.m. and found Robert hanging right after, where was the coffee cup? And why had she been so quick to call him, bypassing the usual emergency services? He glanced back at Emma, who looked utterly lost. Was this the look of a grieving widow? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? He needed more information, but he also didn't want to push her too hard, not yet. All right, Emma, he said, softening his tone. I understand this is difficult. I just need to get to the bottom of this, for Robert's sake. Emma nodded, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. I can't believe he's gone, ***, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was so close to his breakthrough. It was all he talked about. Michael's eyes sharpened at that. What kind of breakthrough, Emma? You said he was working on something that could change the world. Was he getting close to perfecting it? Emma hesitated again, her eyes flickering toward the lab equipment. Yes. I think so. But Robert was paranoid. He thought someone was after his research. That's why he was working so late, locking himself in here. Detective Michael nodded thoughtfully, making mental notes. The missing coffee cup, the late-night work, Robert's obsession with secrecy, it was all adding up to something, but what? Was Emma truly a grieving wife, or was she hiding something crucial? "Thank you for your cooperation, Emma," Michael said, closing his notebook. "I'll need to speak to your household staff next. But for now, try to get some rest." Emma nodded weakly. I'll be in my room if you need me, ***, she said, turning to leave. But before she exited, Michael stopped her. "One more thing," he added, his eyes piercing through her. "If there's anything else, anything at all, that you remember, call me. Even if it seems unimportant." Emma nodded quickly, disappearing down the dark hallway. Michael watched her go, his mind racing. Something wasn't right here. The missing coffee cup was a small detail, but he had learned long ago that the devil was always in the details. He turned back to the lab and took another slow, deliberate look around. The game was just beginning, and Detective Michael Rook was determined to unravel the truth, no matter how tangled the web might be. Detective Michael Rook stood at the entrance of the dimly lit laboratory, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. It was nearing dawn, and the rain outside had slowed to a steady drizzle. The crime scene was eerily silent except for the soft hum of equipment that Robert Ellington had been working on before his untimely death. Beside Michael stood his partner, Detective Vikram Rao, a seasoned investigator known for his keen eye and logical deductions. Vikram, wearing a crisp black suit and gloves, crouched near the lifeless body of Dr. Robert Ellington, which was still hanging from the ceiling beam. He inspected it with an intense focus, his eyes darting between the corpse and the surroundings. "What are you thinking, Vikram?" Michael asked, breaking the silence. His deep voice echoed slightly in the large lab, where the smell of antiseptic and something metallic permeated the air. Vikram didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stood up slowly, removing his gloves and looking back at Michael with a grave expression. "Something's not right here, Michael," he finally said. "You've got my attention," Michael replied, crossing his arms. "What did you find?" Vikram gestured towards Robert's neck, where the noose had left a faint circular mark. "Take a closer look at that mark," he said, stepping aside to give Michael a clearer view. Michael moved forward and squinted at the indentation on Robert's neck. At first glance, it looked like a typical ligature mark from hanging. But as he leaned in closer, he noticed what Vikram had seen. "The mark isn't consistent with hanging," Vikram explained, his voice low and measured. "If someone had hanged themselves, the mark would be angled, typically slanting upward toward the back of the neck. But here, ***, he pointed to the circular impression, "the mark is perfectly horizontal, like someone applied pressure from behind." Michael nodded slowly, his mind racing. "So, you're saying he was strangled first and then hanged to make it look like a suicide?" Vikram's expression grew even more serious. "That's exactly what I'm saying. This wasn't a suicide, Michael. This was staged." Michael ran a hand through his graying hair, his instincts now fully alert. "If that's true, we're looking at a cold-blooded murder, one that's been meticulously planned." Michael began pacing the room, his eyes darting to the various scientific equipment strewn across the lab. The sterile space, filled with beakers, microscopes, and notes scrawled in Robert's handwriting, now felt like the stage of a meticulously planned crime. "Let's think this through," Michael said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "If Robert was indeed strangled first, that means someone had to overpower him. But why go to the trouble of staging it as a hanging?" Vikram shrugged slightly. "Maybe to mislead us, make it look like Robert was overwhelmed by the pressure of his work and decided to take his own life." Michael's eyes narrowed as he considered the possibility. "But that doesn't add up, Vikram." "Emma, his wife, said Robert was on the brink of a breakthrough. If he was about to achieve immortality, why would he end his own life?" Vikram nodded. "Exactly. And if this was indeed a murder, that means someone wanted to stop him, maybe even steal his research." Michael turned his attention to the laboratory's entrance door, replaying Emma's account in his mind. She had claimed she found Robert hanging when she brought him coffee around 2:30 a.m. But something about her story didn't sit well with him, especially now that they had discovered the strangulation mark. "All right, let's focus on what we know," Michael said, gathering his thoughts. "Emma said she came in and found him like this. But if he was strangled first, she would have noticed something off, right?" Vikram's eyes flickered with interest. "Not necessarily. The shock of finding her husband like that could have clouded her judgment. But there's also the possibility, **** he paused, choosing his words carefully, that she was involved in the staging." Michael's gaze darkened. "You think Emma could be behind this?" Vikram shrugged. "We can't rule anyone out at this point. She was the one who found the body, and the first person on the scene is always a prime suspect. But let's not jump to conclusions just yet. We need solid evidence." Michael turned his attention back to Robert's lifeless body. He pulled out a small flashlight from his coat pocket and examined the circular mark on the scientist's neck more closely. The indentation was deep and even, suggesting significant force had been applied. "Whoever did this was strong," Michael muttered, more to himself than to Vikram. "They knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime." Vikram nodded. "Agreed. But let's consider the timeline, Michael. If Robert was strangled and then hanged, that means the murderer had to act quickly. Emma said she found him at 2:30 a.m., so the window of opportunity was small." Michael thought about the coffee Emma had mentioned. "The coffee," he murmured, turning to Vikram. "If she brought him coffee and found him dead immediately after, how did the killer manage to strangle him, hang him, and vanish without leaving a trace?" Vikram rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's possible the killer was already in the lab, hiding. Or maybe, they were someone Robert trusted." Michael looked sharply at his partner. "Like someone who had access to his lab at any hour. Someone like his wife, or, perhaps one of the household staff." The detectives stood in silence, letting the weight of the new evidence settle. The theory that Robert had been murdered was beginning to take shape, but they needed more proof. "We need to speak to the staff," Michael said finally, his voice filled with determination. "If someone was in the lab with Robert that night, they might have seen or heard something." Vikram nodded in agreement. "And we need to take another look at that coffee cup Emma mentioned. If it's still here, maybe we can get some fingerprints off of it. It might tell us who else was with Robert before he died." Michael glanced at the clock on the wall. Dawn was breaking, and with it came the promise of new leads. "Let's start with the staff," he said. "And make sure we get the lab fully dusted for prints. We're going to find out who did this, Vikram, one way or another." Vikram's eyes gleamed with determination. "Agreed. Whoever staged this scene made a mistake, Michael. We just have to find it." Michael turned toward the door, his trench coat swirling around him as he moved with purpose. This wasn't just a case of suicide, it was murder, cold and calculated. And someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. "Let's go," Michael said, looking back at Vikram. "We have a murderer to catch." As they left the lab, the first light of dawn illuminated the storm-soaked grounds outside. The case was far from over, and both detectives knew it would take every ounce of their skill to untangle the web of lies surrounding Dr. Robert Ellington's death. But one thing was certain, someone wanted Robert's research to die with him. And Michael was determined to find out who, and why. The atmosphere in the living room was heavy, the air thick with tension. Detective Michael Rook sat across from Emma Ellington, the widow of the late Dr. Robert Ellington, who had been found dead just hours earlier. The early morning sun peeked through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows on the floor, as if the room itself was unwilling to fully illuminate the secrets hidden within its walls. Emma, her eyes rimmed red from crying, was clutching a handkerchief in her trembling hands. Her elegant black dress was slightly wrinkled, and her usually composed demeanor was now replaced with a haunted look. Sitting beside her, Detective Michael leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her, while Detective Vikram stood near the window, observing the woman with quiet intensity. "Emma," Michael began softly, trying to keep his voice steady and calm, "we need to understand what Robert was working on. If we are going to solve this case, we need every detail you can remember." Emma looked up, her eyes filling with a mixture of grief and something else, fear, perhaps. She took a shaky breath, then nodded. I'll tell you everything, asterisk asterisk, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you must understand, Robert was very secretive. He didn't trust anyone." Michael exchanged a quick glance with Vikram, who nodded almost imperceptibly. This was the breakthrough they needed. "Go on," Michael urged gently. "What was Robert working on?" Emma closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the courage to reveal something she had never intended to share. "Robert, he was working on something revolutionary, something that would change the world." "What kind of project?" Vikram asked, stepping away from the window and coming closer, his deep voice adding weight to the question. Emma hesitated, her fingers tightening around the handkerchief. "He was developing a medicine, one that would grant immortality," she finally confessed, her voice cracking. The room seemed to grow even quieter, as if it were holding its breath. Michael leaned back, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. "Immortality?" he echoed, almost in disbelief. Emma nodded, tears welling up again. "Yes. Robert believed he was on the brink of a discovery that would change humanity forever. It's why he worked day and night, hardly sleeping, barely eating. He was consumed by it." Michael exchanged a glance with Vikram, who had now crossed his arms, his face a mask of concentration. The implications of what Emma had just revealed were staggering. "Are you telling us," Vikram began slowly, his voice laced with skepticism, "that your husband was creating a formula that would stop aging? A medicine that could make someone live forever?" Emma nodded, her eyes wide and desperate. "Yes. That's exactly what I'm saying. Robert believed he could conquer death itself." Michael rubbed his temples, trying to process this new information. "Emma, if what you're saying is true, then Robert's research would be invaluable. Anyone would kill to get their hands on it. Are you sure no one else knew about it?" Emma's face went pale, and she shook her head vigorously. "No. Robert was extremely careful. He trusted no one but me. He kept all his research locked up in the lab, and he never spoke about it to anyone outside." Vikram stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "And you're absolutely certain? No one at the university? No colleagues, no friends, no investors?" Emma hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but Michael caught it. "Emma, if you're withholding information, now is the time to tell us," he said firmly. "We can't help you if we don't have the full picture." She shook her head slowly, tears now streaming down her face. "I swear, only Robert and I knew. He was paranoid, detective. He didn't trust anyone, not even his closest colleagues." Michael leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What about your household staff? Could they have overheard something? Seen something in the lab?" Emma's voice trembled as she answered, "No, they weren't allowed near the lab. Robert was very strict about that. The lab was always locked, and only he and I had the keys." There was a moment of silence as Michael and Vikram absorbed what Emma had just revealed. If Robert was indeed working on a formula for immortality, that could explain why someone would want him dead. But the question remained, who? And more importantly, how did they find out? Michael's mind was racing. Emma, if Robert was this close to a breakthrough, wouldn't he have taken extra precautions? Maybe hidden his research somewhere safe? Emma looked away, her hands wringing together. He kept everything on his computer and in handwritten journals. But the journals are written in a code only he understood. Vikram raised an eyebrow. A code? Do you know how to decipher it? She shook her head. No. He never told me how. He said it was for my own protection, in case something like this happened. Michael leaned back, exhaling slowly. All right, let's assume for a moment that only you and Robert knew about this project. But secrets have a way of leaking out, Emma. Are you absolutely sure that no one else could have known? Emma's eyes flickered with something, a memory, perhaps, but she quickly looked down, avoiding his gaze. Emma, Michael said softly but firmly, we're not here to judge. We're here to find out who killed your husband. If there's something you're not telling us, now is the time. It could save your life. She looked up, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. There was one incident, she confessed in a barely audible whisper. About 2 weeks ago, Robert received an anonymous email. It was threatening. The person claimed they knew about his research and demanded a meeting. Michael's eyes widened. Why didn't you mention this earlier? I was scared, ***, she admitted, her voice breaking. Robert brushed it off. He thought it was just a prank, someone trying to scare him. He never imagined, ***, she trailed off, her voice choking with emotion. Vikram's expression turned even more serious. Do you still have that email? Emma nodded slowly. Yes, I think it's still on his computer. But I don't know the password. Michael exchanged a look with Vikram. We'll get our tech team on it, he said. If someone threatened Robert, then that person might have had a motive to kill him. Michael stood up, straightening his coat. Emma, thank you for your cooperation. I know this is difficult, but we're going to do everything we can to find out what happened to Robert. She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Please, detective, she whispered, you have to find whoever did this. Robert was so close, he was going to change the world. As the detectives turned to leave, Vikram leaned in closer to Michael and whispered, this changes everything, doesn't it? If someone knew about Robert's research, we're not just dealing with a simple murder. This could be much bigger. Michael nodded, his jaw set with determination. Yes, and if we don't find out who's behind this, more people might die. Let's get that email decrypted and start tracking down anyone who might have known about Robert's project. As they walked out of the mansion, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, as if nature itself was mourning the loss of Dr. Robert Ellington. The detectives knew that this case was far from over. The revelation of Robert's secret project had opened a Pandora's box, and they were only beginning to uncover the dark forces at play. The grand living room of the Ellington mansion was eerily quiet, broken only by the faint ticking of an antique clock on the wall. The house, which had once been filled with the sounds of Robert's enthusiastic experiments and discussions, now felt like a tomb. Detective Michael Rook sat back in his chair, his notebook open on his lap, while Detective Vikram paced slowly near the fireplace, his eyes never leaving Emma. Emma Ellington sat stiffly on the edge of the velvet sofa, wringing her hands. The grief in her eyes had started to mix with something else, nervousness, perhaps. The detectives could sense it. They knew there was more to this story, something she was holding back. Michael leaned forward, his tone gentle yet probing. Emma, you said earlier that Robert didn't trust anyone with his research. But let's be realistic here. Someone must have known, even if only a little. It's hard to keep something this big entirely secret, especially in a house with other people around. Emma's eyes flickered to the floor, and she bit her lower lip as if contemplating whether to share more. I've already told you. Robert was very careful, ***, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. No one was allowed near his lab. He kept it locked at all times, and he only trusted me with the key. Vikram stopped pacing and turned to face her. But you did have help around the house, didn't you? You mentioned earlier that you had 3 workers here. Could any of them have seen something, overheard a conversation? Emma hesitated, the silence in the room stretching uncomfortably. She was clearly grappling with something. Finally, she sighed heavily, as if releasing a burden. Yes, she admitted. There are 3 staff members who work here. But I assure you, they were never allowed anywhere near Robert's lab. Michael's eyes narrowed as he scribbled a note in his book. We need to talk to them, Emma. If they were in the house, they could have seen or heard something unusual, even if they didn't understand what it was. Emma looked conflicted, but she nodded. I understand. But I'm telling you, Robert was incredibly cautious. He didn't want anyone interfering with his work. Michael closed his notebook and leaned back, trying to project a sense of calm, even though he felt the case tightening around him like a noose. All right, Emma. Let's start with the basics. Who are these 3 workers? How long have they been employed here? Emma took a deep breath. There's Oliver, our gardener. He's been with us for nearly 5 years. He's loyal and, well, he keeps to himself mostly. Then there's Priya, the housemaid. She's been here for about 2 years. She's diligent and very respectful. And finally, there's Carlos, the cook. He's the newest addition, only joined us a few months ago. Vikram raised an eyebrow. A few months ago? That's recent. Do you know anything about Carlos's background? Emma shook her head. Robert hired him. He said Carlos was recommended by a colleague. But I never questioned it. I trusted Robert's judgment. Michael exchanged a knowing glance with Vikram. A new hire so close to Robert's mysterious death. It was definitely worth looking into. When was the last time you saw each of them? Michael asked. They were all here last night, Emma replied. I remember Carlos was in the kitchen preparing Robert's late-night coffee. Priya was tidying up the library, and Oliver, well, I assume he was outside tending to the garden as usual. Michael and Vikram decided it was time to question the household staff. Emma reluctantly led them to the servants' quarters, which were located in a separate wing of the sprawling mansion. The first to be summoned was Oliver, the gardener. He was a wiry man in his late 50s with sun-weathered skin and a perpetually stooped posture. He stood nervously in front of the detectives, wringing his hands. Oliver, Michael began, keeping his tone neutral, we need to ask you a few questions about last night. Did you see or hear anything unusual? Oliver's eyes darted nervously to Emma before he responded. No, sir. I was in the garden the whole time. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Vikram stepped forward, his gaze sharp. You didn't hear any strange noises? Perhaps someone moving about inside the house? Oliver shook his head vehemently. No, detective. I was outside. The garden keeps me busy. But Michael noticed something. Oliver's fingers were twitching slightly, a telltale sign of anxiety. Oliver, we'll need to check your toolshed and the grounds. Just to be sure. The gardener's face paled, but he nodded. Yes, of course, sir. Next up was Priya, the maid. She was a young woman, barely in her 30s, with dark hair neatly tied back and a nervous energy that filled the room. Priya, Michael began, giving her a reassuring smile, we just need to confirm where you were around 2:30 a.m. last night. Can you account for your whereabouts? Priya nodded quickly. Yes, sir. I was in the library, dusting and arranging the books, just as Mrs. Ellington instructed. Vikram crossed his arms. Did you hear or see anything unusual? Perhaps someone going towards the lab? She hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. No, sir. I didn't see or hear anything strange. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, perhaps. Michael made a mental note to revisit her later. Finally, it was Carlos, the cook's turn. He was a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard and a confident demeanor. He didn't seem as nervous as the others. Carlos, Michael began, keeping his gaze steady, you were preparing coffee for Robert last night, is that correct? Carlos nodded with a faint smile. Yes, Detective. Dr. Ellington often worked late into the night. He liked his coffee strong and black. I made him a fresh pot around 2 a.m. Vikram leaned in, his voice low. Did you see anyone else near the lab or hear any unusual sounds while you were in the kitchen? Carlos shrugged casually. No, sir. I was focused on the coffee. The kitchen is far from the lab, so I wouldn't have heard anything even if something happened. As the detectives walked back to the main hall, Vikram shook his head in frustration. They're either all clueless, or one of them is a damn good liar. Michael sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Emma insists that none of them had access to the lab, but secrets have a way of slipping out, especially in a household like this. If Robert was truly on the brink of discovering a medicine for immortality, that's a motive big enough to tempt anyone. Vikram nodded slowly. But how would any of them even know about it? According to Emma, only she and Robert were aware of the project. Michael stopped walking, his eyes narrowing as a thought struck him. Unless, he said slowly, someone overheard something they weren't supposed to. Or, Vikram added, one of them was lying through their teeth. Michael nodded, his eyes dark with determination. Let's check the lab again. If Robert's research was as valuable as Emma claims, there has to be a clue somewhere. And I want a deeper background check on all 3 workers, especially Carlos. Something tells me there's more to this story. As they headed back to the lab, the house seemed to loom over them, its secrets hiding in every shadow. There was a storm brewing, and the detectives could feel it. The question was, who was behind it? And how far would they go to keep the secrets buried? The dimly lit room in the Ellington mansion had turned into an interrogation chamber. The tension was palpable as the scent of polished wood and the faint remnants of coffee from the early morning hours lingered in the air. Detective Michael Rook and his partner, Vikram, were seated across a wide mahogany table, their eyes fixed on the first of the 3 workers who had been called in for questioning. Alex, the gardener, was a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and a deeply furrowed brow. His hands were rough and calloused from years of tending to the sprawling grounds of the mansion. But tonight, they were trembling slightly. As he sat on the edge of the chair, his eyes darted nervously between the 2 detectives. The ticking of the antique clock on the wall seemed to grow louder, filling the silence as if daring him to break it. Michael leaned back, adjusting his notepad. All right, Alex, he said in a calm, measured tone. Let's go over this again. You said you were trying to sleep around 2:10 a.m., but you heard something. Is that right? Alex nodded slowly, swallowing hard. Yes, detective, he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. I was in my room, trying to get some rest. The day had been long, pruning the hedges, clearing the leaves. I was exhausted. Vikram leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And yet, you heard a noise. What kind of noise exactly? The gardener took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. It was, like a rustling sound, you know. As if something was moving through the bushes in the garden. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but then it sounded more deliberate. Michael raised an eyebrow, scribbling a quick note. Deliberate? How so? Alex hesitated, running a hand through his thinning hair. It wasn't like the usual sounds you hear at night, crickets, the wind, the occasional stray cat. This was different. Heavier. Like footsteps, but light. At that hour, I just assumed it was one of those stray cats from the neighborhood looking for food. Footsteps, you say? Vikram cut in, his voice sharp. Are you sure about that, Alex? Because the difference between a cat and a human is pretty significant, wouldn't you agree? Alex's eyes widened, clearly flustered. I'm not saying it was a person, detective. I'm just saying it didn't sound like an animal, at least not one I'm familiar with. Michael watched Alex closely, noting the beads of sweat forming on the man's forehead despite the chill in the air. Alright, Alex. Let's say it wasn't a cat. Did you get up to check? Did you look out the window to see if someone was in the garden? Alex shook his head quickly, almost too quickly. No, sir. I was too tired. I just turned over in bed and tried to ignore it. Besides, this place has always been safe. I figured if it was something important, the security cameras would catch it. The security cameras, Michael repeated slowly, tapping his pen against his notepad. Funny you should mention that. Because according to our initial review, footage from around that time is mysteriously missing. The color drained from Alex's face. Missing? He stammered. I wouldn't know anything about that. I swear. I just mind my own business in the garden. Vikram exchanged a quick look with Michael. Something wasn't adding up. Listen, Alex, Vikram said, lowering his voice as if to convey a sense of understanding, if there's something you're not telling us, now would be a good time to come clean. It's better for you in the long run. Alex's hands gripped the edges of his chair, his knuckles turning white. I've told you everything, sir. I heard a noise, thought it was nothing, and went back to bed. That's it. Detective Michael wasn't satisfied. There was something off about Alex's story. It felt, rehearsed, like he was trying too hard to sound innocent. Michael decided to change tactics. Alex, he began, this time in a softer, almost conspiratorial tone, you've worked here for years, right? You knew Dr. Robert well? Alex nodded, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. Yes, sir. I've been here for 5 years. Dr. Robert was a good man, always polite, paid on time, kept to himself mostly, especially after he started that secret project of his. Vikram leaned forward, seizing on that last comment. You knew about the secret project? The gardener's eyes widened, and he shook his head vehemently. No, sir. I mean, I knew he was working on something, but I never asked questions. It wasn't my place. I just take care of the garden. Michael decided to push a little further. Let's say, hypothetically, someone wanted to sneak into the lab undetected. Would the garden be a good way to do that? Alex's eyes flickered nervously. I suppose so. The windows to the lab are on the east side, facing the garden. But they're always locked. Dr. Robert was very particular about security. But not so particular that someone couldn't bypass it if they were determined, Vikram muttered under his breath, scribbling a note. Michael leaned back in his chair, regarding Alex with a thoughtful expression. All right, let's move on. You said you heard the noise at 2:10 a.m. But the incident with Dr. Robert happened closer to 2:30 a.m. That's a 20-minute gap. Are you sure you didn't hear anything else during that time? Alex shook his head, looking more nervous than ever. No, sir. Just that one noise. After that, it was quiet, until Mrs. Ellington screamed. Vikram raised an eyebrow. You heard her scream? Alex nodded. Yes, sir. That's what woke me up for real. I ran out into the hallway, but by the time I got there, she was already on the phone, crying for help. Michael nodded, jotting down a few notes. All right, Alex. That'll be all for now. But don't go far. We may have more questions for you. The gardener stood up, his hands still shaking, and hurried out of the room. As the door closed behind him, Vikram turned to Michael. What do you think? Vikram asked, crossing his arms. He's definitely hiding something, but I can't tell if it's out of guilt or fear. Michael sighed, tapping his pen thoughtfully against his notepad. I don't think he's our killer. But he knows more than he's letting on. That sound he heard in the garden, someone was moving around out there, Vikram. And I'm willing to bet it wasn't a stray cat. Agreed, Vikram replied. But the question is, who was it? And why was the security footage conveniently missing? Michael stood up, a look of determination in his eyes. Let's bring in the next worker. Maybe we'll get more answers. As the detectives prepared for their next round of questioning, a cold gust of wind rattled the windows. Outside, the garden that had once been Robert's sanctuary now seemed to whisper secrets into the night. And somewhere, hidden within those secrets, lay the key to solving this twisted mystery. The interrogation room was now filled with a slight chill, the weight of suspicion hanging heavy in the air like an impending storm. Detective Michael Rook and his partner Vikram had just finished questioning Alex, the gardener, whose nervousness had sparked more questions than answers. Now, they turned their attention to the second worker, Daniel, the housekeeper. Daniel was a tall, wiry man in his mid-30s, with dark circles under his eyes and a slightly disheveled appearance. He sat in the chair opposite the detectives, wringing his hands nervously as he waited for the questioning to begin. The room was eerily silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional rustle of papers as Detective Michael prepared his notes. Michael took a deep breath and leaned forward, his piercing eyes fixed on Daniel. "All right, Daniel. Let's get straight to it. You said earlier that you were in the bathroom around the time of Dr. Robert's death. I need you to walk me through that again, step by step." Daniel swallowed hard and nodded, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Yes, Detective. I was in the bathroom. My stomach was killing me. I think it was something I ate at dinner." Vikram raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Something you ate? You were sick enough to be in the bathroom for an entire hour?" Daniel's face flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, sir. I know it sounds strange, but it was really bad. I've had issues with my stomach for a while now. I was in there longer than usual." Michael tilted his head, watching Daniel's body language. There was something about the way Daniel spoke, as if he was trying hard to convince them of his story. Michael decided to press him further. "You do realize, Daniel, that you're telling us you were conveniently locked away in the bathroom at the exact time Dr. Robert was found dead? That's quite the alibi, ***, Michael said, his tone cool and calculated. Daniel's eyes widened, and he shook his head frantically. "I swear, Detective. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't even hear anything. I was in the bathroom the whole time, I promise." Vikram scribbled something in his notebook and then looked up, his gaze sharp. "Let's backtrack a bit. What time did you go into the bathroom exactly?" Daniel furrowed his brow, clearly trying to recall. "I think it was around 1:30 or 1:40 a.m. I had just finished cleaning up the kitchen when I started feeling sick. I went straight to the bathroom and, well, I stayed there for a long while." Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Daniel's expression. "So, you're saying you were in the bathroom until after 2:30 a.m. That's when Mrs. Ellington found Dr. Robert's body and called us. You heard nothing during that entire time? No screams? No commotion?" Daniel's hands began to tremble slightly as he clasped them together on his lap. "No, sir. The bathroom is on the other side of the house, near the servants' quarters. It's far from Dr. Robert's lab. And, well, I had the exhaust fan running to, drown out the sounds." Vikram leaned forward, his eyes piercing through Daniel's weak defenses. "Let me get this straight, you were completely unaware that a murder had taken place just down the hall from you? Not even the scream Mrs. Ellington let out? Or the sound of footsteps as people rushed around?" Daniel's face turned pale, and he shook his head desperately. "No, Detective. I swear on my mother's grave, I heard nothing. I was just trying to get through, my stomach cramps, ***, his voice broke, and it was clear he was struggling to maintain his composure. Michael exchanged a quick glance with Vikram, who nodded slightly, indicating they were on the same page. Something about Daniel's story didn't sit right. It seemed too convenient, too neatly tied up with a bow. Michael decided to change tactics. "Daniel," Michael said, his tone softening slightly. "Listen, we're not here to accuse you of anything, at least not yet. But you have to understand, the timeline you're giving us is crucial. If you were in the bathroom for that entire hour, we need to verify it. So, let me ask you, is there anyone who can confirm that you were in there the whole time?" Daniel looked up, his eyes wide with desperation. "No, detective. I was alone. There's no one who could have seen me. Everyone else was asleep, and I didn't think to tell anyone I was feeling sick." Vikram scribbled another note in his book, then tapped it with his pen. "You're aware we're going to check the bathroom, right? If you were in there, we'll know. And if you're lying, we'll find that out too." The color drained from Daniel's face, and he nodded vigorously. "I'm not lying, detective. Please, you have to believe me. I was sick, that's all." Michael studied him for a moment, considering the fear in Daniel's eyes. He couldn't tell if the man was genuinely terrified or just a skilled liar. But something wasn't adding up. Vikram closed his notebook with a snap. "All right, Daniel. We're going to take a look at that bathroom. If you're telling the truth, you've got nothing to worry about. But if we find anything that suggests otherwise, ****, he left the threat hanging in the air, watching as Daniel swallowed nervously. The detectives excused themselves and headed down the dimly lit corridor toward the servants' quarters. The old mansion creaked with each step they took, the floorboards groaning under their weight. The bathroom Daniel had mentioned was small and cramped, with pale yellow tiles that had seen better days. A faint scent of bleach lingered in the air, suggesting someone had recently cleaned it. Michael pushed open the door and flipped on the light. The tiny room was exactly as Daniel had described, a small toilet, a chipped sink, and an exhaust fan humming softly above. The detectives searched for any signs of tampering, but the room appeared untouched. "Looks like he was telling the truth," Vikram muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "Or at least, he's covered his tracks well enough." Michael ran his fingers along the edge of the sink, thinking. If he was really in here for that long, there should be some sign of it. A lingering smell, evidence of medication, something. But the room offered no further clues. They had hit a dead end, at least for now. Michael's mind was racing. If Daniel was indeed in the bathroom, then he couldn't have been involved directly in Dr. Robert's death. But his alibi was still too convenient. What if he had an accomplice? Someone who used that 20-minute gap to stage the scene. The detectives returned to the interrogation room, where Daniel sat waiting, his fingers drumming nervously against the wooden table. Michael leaned forward, his eyes boring into Daniel's. "We've checked the bathroom, Daniel," Michael said, his voice low and deliberate. "And it seems you were telling the truth. But here's the thing, being in the bathroom doesn't mean you're completely off the hook. You might not have killed Dr. Robert yourself, but you could have helped someone else." Daniel's eyes widened, and he shook his head furiously. "No, detective. I didn't help anyone. I swear, I was just sick. I don't know anything about the doctor's death." Michael leaned back, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "We'll see about that. For now, stay put. We're not done with you yet." As the detectives left the room, Vikram turned to Michael. "What do you think? Is he genuinely clueless, or just playing dumb?" Michael's expression was grim. "I don't know yet. But one thing's for sure, Daniel's story might check out, but there's still something he's not telling us. And I intend to find out what that is." The investigation had taken a strange turn. With Alex's strange tale of hearing a noise in the garden and Daniel's lengthy bathroom alibi, it was clear to Detective Michael Rook and his partner Vikram that they needed to dive deeper into the testimonies of the remaining workers. Now, it was time to speak with Lisa, the third and final worker in the house on the night Dr. Robert had been found dead. Lisa was a young woman in her early 20s, with short, dark hair and a nervous energy that was impossible to miss. She had been a recent hire, brought in by Emma Ellington to help around the house. Unlike the other two workers, she didn't seem to have the weathered, seasoned air of someone who had been around the mansion for a long time. No, Lisa was a bit of a mystery, a newcomer in a house that had been full of secrets long before she ever walked through its doors. The detectives found her in the kitchen, nervously stirring a cup of coffee that seemed to be more of a habit than a necessity. The once grand kitchen now felt sterile, cold in the early morning hours. The usual warmth of the house had been replaced with the unsettling chill of suspicion. As Michael entered the room, Lisa looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "Detective, is it really necessary for me to be here right now?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Michael gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know this is difficult, Lisa. But we need to go over your account of the night. The more details we get, the closer we'll be to understanding what happened to Dr. Robert." Lisa's lips quivered as she nodded, setting down her coffee mug. "I understand. I just don't know what I could have possibly seen. I was in the kitchen the whole time, just making the coffee." Vikram folded his arms and leaned against the counter. "Making coffee, huh? That's the third time we've heard that tonight. But we need to hear your version of events." Lisa's eyes shifted nervously between the two detectives, her hands fidgeting with the sleeve of her blouse. "Well, I was told to make a second cup of coffee. Mrs. Ellington told me the first one had gone bad. She said Dr. Robert didn't like it, so I was making a fresh pot for him." She paused and glanced at Michael for any reaction. "That's all. That's all I was doing." Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. "Lisa, what time was this exactly?" Lisa hesitated. "It was around 2 a.m., maybe a little after." She swallowed hard, her voice beginning to quiver. "I know it sounds strange, but I was in the kitchen for a while." Vikram raised an eyebrow. "A while? How long exactly?" Lisa's eyes darted away from his gaze. "Well, I was making the coffee, and then the power went out. I couldn't see to make the second cup, and the lights didn't come back on for a while." Michael exchanged a quick glance with Vikram. This was the first time they were hearing about a power outage, and it seemed like something that could be key to the timeline. He leaned in a little closer, studying Lisa. "The lights went out. What time did that happen?" Lisa bit her lip and thought for a moment. "It was just after I started making the coffee. Maybe around 2:05 or so. I'm not sure. But it was right after I started. The lights flickered, then they went out completely. I had to wait in the dark to finish the coffee." Vikram stepped forward, his expression hardening. "And how long was it until the lights came back on?" Lisa looked down, her fingers still nervously twisting. "Maybe 20 minutes or so. I don't really know. I was in the kitchen, waiting for them to come back on." Michael's mind was working quickly now. 20 minutes was a significant amount of time in the context of the murder. That meant that during those 20 minutes, anything could have happened. The lights going out just before the body was found raised questions. "What did you do during that time, Lisa?" "The lights were out, you said. Were you just standing there, waiting for them to come back on?" Lisa nodded. "I couldn't really do anything else. I thought the power would come back on soon, but it didn't. I couldn't see to finish the coffee. So I just stood there." Michael's tone sharpened. "Did you hear anything? Any noises? Anything unusual?" Lisa's eyes widened, and she shook her head vigorously. No, detective. I didn't hear anything. I was just standing there. I wasn't paying attention to anything else." Vikram spoke up, his voice skeptical. "Are you sure? Nothing? No sounds of someone coming down the hallway, maybe? No footsteps or voices?" Lisa's face flushed with embarrassment. She hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. I didn't hear anything, Detective Vikram. I swear. The house was so quiet, it was like everyone was asleep. I was just waiting. Michael studied her carefully, trying to read her expression. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation, a nervous twitch that suggested she was hiding something. But whether it was guilt or simple nervousness, he couldn't be sure. Okay, Lisa. But here's the thing. You were the last person to see Dr. Robert alive, and you're telling me that during the entire time the lights were out, you didn't hear anything strange? Lisa quickly shook her head. I didn't hear anything, Detective. I swear on my life. Her voice was shaking now, and she seemed genuinely distressed. I didn't do anything. I didn't even know Dr. Robert was dead until Mrs. Ellington called you. Michael and Vikram exchanged another glance. It was clear that Lisa was either telling the truth or was an incredibly skilled liar. And yet, her story didn't add up. She was standing in the kitchen, the lights out for 20 minutes, plenty of time for something to have happened, but she claimed to have heard nothing. Michael couldn't let it go. The power outage could be the crucial detail they were missing. Tell me again, Lisa, he asked, his voice more insistent now. How do you know the lights came back on after 20 minutes? Lisa looked at him with confusion. What do you mean? The lights just came back on. When the power came back, I finished making the coffee. Then I brought it to Mrs. Ellington and Dr. Robert. Vikram's eyes narrowed. You're sure the lights came on exactly when the power came back? Lisa's face went pale, and she blinked rapidly. I don't know exactly when. I just remember the lights flickering back on, and then I was able to finish the coffee. Michael's mind raced. Something about the power outage wasn't sitting right with him. If the lights went out at 2:05 a.m., and the body was discovered at 2:30 a.m., there was a window of about 20 minutes where no one could see what was happening. And if Lisa had been in the kitchen, that would mean she was in the perfect position to hear something, but she hadn't heard a thing. It was a simple conclusion: Lisa was either lying about hearing nothing, or someone had been very careful to make sure no one else could hear the events unfolding. But what was the truth? Michael let the silence linger for a moment, allowing the tension to build. Lisa, he said, his voice calm yet steady. Did you have any idea what Dr. Robert was working on? Did he ever tell you about his research? Lisa's face softened, and for a brief moment, it looked as if a flicker of understanding passed through her eyes. I knew he was working on something important. But no, he never told me what exactly. She paused, her voice quieter now. All I know is that it had something to do with immortality, but that's it. Michael leaned in, his eyes never leaving hers. Immortality, huh? You seem to know more than you're letting on, Lisa. What's going on here? Why are you so nervous? Lisa's lips trembled, and she looked away, clearly avoiding his gaze. I don't know anything about Dr. Robert's death. I just did what I was asked to do. That's it. Detective Michael Rook sat in the dimly lit living room of the Ellington mansion, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of floorboards and the soft whisper of wind against the windows. The atmosphere in the house had changed since the discovery of Dr. Robert's body. The usual warmth and comfort that the Ellingtons had once enjoyed had been replaced by a cold, oppressive silence. Detective Vikram Singh was sitting across from him, scanning the various documents and notes they had gathered so far. Their questioning of the three workers, Alex, Daniel, and Lisa, had raised more questions than answers. Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. There was something off about the whole situation, something not adding up. Every worker had given their account of the events of that night, but the more Michael thought about it, the more inconsistencies he found. And of all the workers, it was Lisa's story that bothered him the most. Vikram, Michael said, breaking the silence. His voice was low but firm. I'm starting to see a pattern here, but it's not adding up. There's something wrong with Lisa's statement, especially about that second coffee and the power outage. Something isn't right. Vikram glanced up from his notes, looking over at Michael with a furrowed brow. You think she's lying? Michael nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the notebook on the table. It's not just the coffee. It's the timing, the power going out, and her alibi. Everything feels off. Vikram leaned back in his chair, considering this. So, you're saying her account doesn't match up with the others? What about the rest of the workers? Could they have something to do with it? Michael let out a heavy sigh. I don't know yet, but I think Lisa is hiding something, or at the very least, she's not telling us everything she knows. Her story about making the second coffee doesn't line up with the timeline of events, and the power outage is another red flag. I don't trust it. Michael had been mulling over Lisa's words since the moment she'd spoken them. She claimed that she was in the kitchen, making a second cup of coffee for Emma and Dr. Robert, and that the power went out around 2:05 a.m., just after she started. But something about that didn't sit right with him. The first detail that caught Michael's attention was the specific timing of the power outage. Lisa had said that it occurred around 2:05 a.m., but the body was discovered around 2:30 a.m. There was a gap of 20 minutes in which no one could account for Dr. Robert's movements. But Lisa's story about the power cutting out during that time seemed to place her in the kitchen for the entire duration. And yet, she had no idea what had happened in the rest of the house during those crucial minutes. How could she not have heard anything? Michael muttered to himself, deep in thought. It doesn't make sense. If she was in the kitchen, she should have heard something. A door opening, footsteps, something. Vikram was still flipping through his notes, his brow furrowed as he added his own thoughts. And don't forget the coffee. If she was making the coffee, why didn't she notice anything strange in the house? If Dr. Robert had been alive when she was preparing it, he'd have been in the living room, right? She should have heard him moving around, or maybe even heard Emma's voice. But she said she heard nothing. Michael shook his head, frustration building. Exactly. And the power outage, it doesn't add up. If the lights went out at 2:05, and she was making the coffee for 20 minutes, why did it take so long for the lights to come back on? If it was just a simple electrical issue, it shouldn't have taken that long. Vikram stood up from the table, rubbing his temples. You think Lisa is trying to cover something up? Michael looked over at Vikram, his eyes hardening. I think Lisa knows more than she's letting on. She was in the kitchen for too long, and she's playing it off as if she had no idea what was happening in the rest of the house. That's not possible. Michael stood up, pacing back and forth in the room. He reached for the crime scene photos and the notes on the case, his mind running through the timeline of events once again. There was still too much they didn't know about that night. The power outage, Lisa's strange behavior, the missing CCTV footage, everything was connected, but the pieces weren't fitting together. Here's the thing, Michael began, his voice now calm and controlled as he spoke to Vikram. Lisa's alibi hinges entirely on the power outage, right? If the lights were out for 20 minutes, she's got the perfect window to cover up what happened. But what if the lights going out wasn't the real reason she was in the kitchen for so long? Vikram paused, trying to piece together the information. What are you suggesting? That she used the power outage as an excuse to stay hidden in the kitchen? Michael nodded. Exactly. She couldn't have known for sure that the lights would go out at that precise moment, but she could have planned it. She might have been in the kitchen to avoid being seen by anyone. The lights going out was just a convenient coincidence. Vikram was silent for a moment, clearly thinking it over. So, what do we do now? Do we confront her again? Michael exhaled, his thoughts racing. We need to get a better sense of what happened between 2 o'clock and 2:30 a.m. We need to find out if Lisa's story matches with the rest of the evidence. He glanced over at Vikram. And we need to check the electrical records. Was there really a power outage at the time she claimed, or was she covering up something? Vikram nodded in agreement. I'll head to the power company and see if they have any records of the outage. We'll need to verify her alibi. Michael turned to the stack of papers on the desk. And I'll review the CCTV footage. There's something we missed there, Vikram. I can feel it. As the investigation continued, Michael felt the pressure mounting. Every lead they followed only seemed to uncover more questions. Lisa's alibi had holes, but so did the others. Alex, Daniel, and even Emma had their own inconsistencies, but something about Lisa's behavior struck him as the most suspicious. She was hiding something, that much was clear. Michael knew that time was running out. If they didn't get to the bottom of this soon, the case would go cold. And with each passing moment, it became more and more apparent that Dr. Roberts' death wasn't a random tragedy. It was something planned, something methodical. But by who? As Michael sat alone in the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was right in front of him, hidden beneath layers of lies and deceit. He glanced at his watch. The investigation was just getting started, and every second felt more crucial than the last. He had a sinking feeling that they were close to uncovering the truth, if only he could put all the pieces together before it was too late. Detective Michael Rook sat at the desk in the small office of the Ellington Mansion security room, his eyes fixed on the dark screen in front of him. The CCTV footage was playing on a loop, and he had been reviewing it for the past 30 minutes, but something was nagging at him. There were gaps, large, troubling gaps. He had requested to see the footage from the night of Dr. Roberts' death, hoping it would provide him with some clarity. He needed to know who had been in and around the mansion, what movements could be traced, what shadows lingered. But now, as he rewound the footage to the time between 2 o'clock and 2:20 a.m., the screen remained blank. What the hell? Michael muttered under his breath. He leaned closer, squinting at the dark footage. No matter how many times he rewound and fast-forwarded, the same thing happened. The cameras had recorded everything up until 2 a.m., but after that, the screens went completely dark. A thick, black void filled the next 20 minutes. He rubbed his eyes in frustration and hit the play button once more, hoping it was some sort of glitch. But the result was the same. I've seen enough, Michael muttered. He quickly stood up and walked to the door of the security room, his mind racing with questions. Vikram. Detective Vikram Singh had been combing through the crime scene photographs, still trying to make sense of the evidence, when Michael's voice cut through the quiet. What's going on? Vikram asked, walking toward Michael with an inquisitive look on his face. He could see the frustration etched across Michael's features. There's something strange going on with the CCTV footage, Michael said, motioning for Vikram to follow him back into the room. The footage from 2 a.m. to 2:20 a.m., completely missing. Just gone. Vikram raised an eyebrow. What? How is that even possible? Michael rubbed the back of his neck as he paced the room. I don't know, but I don't like it. Everything else is fine, up until that point. But from exactly 2 to 2:20, it's like the cameras just stopped working. You're sure it's not just a technical issue? Vikram asked, though even he seemed doubtful. I was just about to find out, Michael replied, his tone sharp. I'm going to call the electricity board. I need to know if there was some sort of power outage during that time. It could explain the blackout. As soon as Michael stepped out of the security room, he reached for his phone and dialed the number of the local electricity board. The line rang once, then twice, before someone picked up. Electricity board, how can I assist you? A voice answered. Detective Michael Rook, from the Ellington Mansion investigation, he said firmly. I need to verify something. Were there any power outages in the area, specifically at around 2 a.m. to 2:20 a.m. last night? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before the person responded, their voice neutral but professional. Let me check our records for that time. One moment. Michael stood outside in the chilly evening air, his eyes darting around as he waited. His fingers drummed against the side of the phone, impatience growing with each second. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was too much that didn't add up, too many little things that seemed out of place. Finally, the voice on the other end returned. Detective, I've checked our logs. There was no power outage recorded in that area at the time you mentioned. All services were operating normally. Michael's stomach twisted. He was sure he had heard the words correctly. No power outage. So, the blackout the workers mentioned wasn't real? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. That's correct, the electricity board operator confirmed. We've had no interruptions in service at that time. Michael hung up the phone, his mind racing. No power outage. So, why had Lisa and the other workers insisted that the lights had gone out between 2 o'clock and 2:20 a.m.? It seemed like a convenient excuse, a perfect cover-up. But for what? He called out to Vikram, who was still reviewing the notes inside. Vikram, I need you to double-check the workers' statements. Especially Lisa's. Something's not adding up. Vikram walked into the hallway, meeting Michael at the security room door. I just spoke with the officers in charge of the crime scene. They're still gathering physical evidence. But I'll go over the statements again. What did you find? There was no power outage, Michael said flatly, his jaw tight. The electricity board confirmed it. The blackout that Lisa and the others mentioned? It never happened. Which means, he let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished. Which means Lisa lied, Vikram finished for him, his face darkening. But why? And what was she hiding? Michael nodded slowly, a thought forming in his mind. We need to focus on what happened during those 20 minutes. If the footage is gone and the power was fine, that means someone deliberately erased that time. But who had access to the cameras, or at least knew enough to tamper with them? Vikram shook his head, clearly troubled. I don't know. But whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They covered their tracks carefully. Too carefully. As Michael and Vikram walked back through the mansion, their footsteps echoed through the hallways. The house seemed unnaturally still, the silence hanging thick around them. The grand staircase loomed ahead, leading up to Dr. Robert's private research lab. They entered the lab, the scene of the crime. The same oppressive air that had filled the room when they first discovered the body still lingered. Michael looked around, taking in the same sterile, organized environment. Everything seemed to be in its place. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had been hidden in plain sight. Something's wrong with this whole setup, Michael murmured, looking around the lab. The missing footage, the blackout lie, the strange behavior of the workers, it's all connected. Vikram was inspecting a piece of paper on Dr. Robert's desk, his brow furrowed. I agree. But the question is, what exactly are they covering up? The missing footage doesn't just indicate a technical failure, it's deliberate. Michael's eyes narrowed. I need to speak to Lisa again. I need her to explain why she lied about the power outage and what happened during those missing 20 minutes. She's the key to unraveling all of this. Later that afternoon, Lisa was brought back to the mansion for another round of questioning. She sat in the small interrogation room, her posture rigid, her eyes darting nervously between Michael and Vikram. She had been cooperative so far, but something in her demeanor had shifted. The guilt was written all over her face. Lisa, Michael began, his voice calm but firm. You told us earlier that the power went out around 2 a.m. But the electricity board confirmed there was no outage. So, let me ask you again, what really happened between 2 o'clock and 2:20 a.m.? Lisa swallowed hard, her eyes shifting nervously. I don't know what to tell you. The lights went out. I was in the kitchen, making the coffee, and then everything went dark. She tried to keep her voice steady, but Michael could see the cracks starting to show. That's not what we found, Michael said, his voice steady. The electricity board confirmed no outage. Which means you're lying. Why? Lisa's hands trembled as she clutched her lap. I didn't mean to lie. I just panicked. I didn't know what to say. The lights went out, and I didn't want anyone to know what happened in the lab. She stopped herself, then looked up, her eyes filled with tears. But I didn't kill him. I swear. Michael leaned forward, his gaze intense. Who did, Lisa? Who killed Dr. Robert? Detective Michael Rook stood silently, his gaze fixed on the electric meter box outside the mansion. The evening air was crisp, and the shadow of the towering estate loomed behind him. He squatted down, running his gloved hand over the dirt-streaked ground near the meter. There was something there, something that didn't belong. A faint impression in the dirt, barely noticeable to the untrained eye, caught his attention. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He had already walked through the crime scene, checked the lab, questioned the workers, and reviewed the CCTV footage. But now, here, in the quiet and isolated area near the electric meter, he had stumbled upon something that felt like a breakthrough. Vikram. He called out, his voice low but urgent. Vikram Singh, his ever-faithful partner, was not far behind. He had been inspecting the grounds near the garden, carefully studying the paths that led to and from the mansion. At Michael's call, Vikram hurried over, his boots crunching over the gravel beneath him. What is it? Vikram asked, noticing Michael's intense focus on the ground near the electric meter. Michael pointed to the soil, his fingers tracing the faint outline of footprints that were partially obscured by the dust and earth. Look at this, he muttered, his voice steady but filled with a sense of realization. Someone's been here. Vikram crouched beside Michael, inspecting the footprints carefully. What am I looking at? Michael squinted at the marks in the dirt. These footprints, they're fresh, and they're not from anyone in the house. Not from the workers, anyway. These were left by someone who entered and exited the mansion. See here. He pointed to the indentation of a boot heel. This is the first set, coming in. Vikram nodded, scrutinizing the pattern more closely. And then this one, he said, trailing his finger over the second set of footprints. It's the reverse pattern, so someone walked out after. Michael's mind raced as he processed this new information. The footprints were proof of an entry and exit, but there was no indication that anyone had actually been seen coming or going. Whoever it was, they knew how to cover their tracks. They were careful. Too careful. Vikram stood up, surveying the area. So, what are we thinking? Someone came in, tampered with the power, then left again, without leaving a trace. Michael rose slowly, his eyes never leaving the footprints. That's exactly what I'm thinking. But why? Why would someone need to cut the power at that specific moment? The answer seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Michael was certain that the missing CCTV footage, the strange accounts from the workers, and the blackout all tied into this. But the question was, who had the knowledge, the access, and the reason to execute such a calculated move? Whoever it was, they had done it with precision. We need to dig deeper into this, Michael said, his voice cold with determination. There's something bigger here, Vikram. I can feel it. Let's go back to the house. Back inside the mansion, Michael and Vikram stood in the foyer, reviewing their findings so far. The house seemed eerily quiet now, the hum of the modern world outside muffled by the high walls and the thick curtains. But inside, the tension was palpable. It felt as though the walls themselves were hiding something, something that no one was ready to admit. So, we know someone entered the property during that blackout window, Vikram began, pacing the floor. But who? Michael didn't respond immediately. He was thinking. Thinking about everything, the workers, the missing footage, the blackout lie. All of it pointed to someone trying to cover their tracks. He could almost hear the faint echo of the lies they had been fed. But why were they lying? What was the motive? We're going to need to question them again, Michael said finally, his voice determined. Especially Lisa. Her account doesn't match up, and now we know someone tampered with the power supply. Someone who knew when to act and where to go. Vikram paused, a skeptical look crossing his face. You think it's her? Michael shook his head. I don't know yet. But I think she knows more than she's letting on. That night, they brought the 3 workers back in for another round of questioning. Each one filed into the small interrogation room, their faces drawn, their eyes wary. They had already been questioned once, but this time, there was a new, sharper edge to the detective's approach. They were no longer simply trying to find out what had happened. They were trying to catch a liar. Lisa, Michael began, his voice calm but firm as he looked directly at her. We found footprints near the electric meter. Someone tampered with the power during the blackout. Tell me, what do you know about that? Lisa's face paled at the mention of the footprints. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes darted to the floor. I don't know, she stammered, clearly rattled. I told you, I was just in the kitchen. I didn't see anything unusual. I don't know anything about the power going out or the footprints. Vikram stepped forward, his tone more forceful. You expect us to believe that? The power didn't go out, Lisa. The electricity board confirmed that. So either you're lying about what happened, or someone's using you to cover their tracks. Which one is it? Lisa recoiled slightly, as if struck. She glanced nervously at the other workers, then back at Michael. I didn't do anything. I swear. She broke off, her voice cracking. Michael leaned in, his gaze never leaving hers. You're lying, Lisa. You're not telling us everything. You said you were in the kitchen making coffee. But that's not the whole story, is it? Lisa swallowed hard, tears welling up in her eyes. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could speak, the other worker, Daniel, interrupted. This is ridiculous, Daniel said, shaking his head. Lisa doesn't know anything. She told you what happened. I was in the bathroom the whole time, and Alex was sleeping. What do you want from us? Michael turned toward Daniel, his eyes narrowing. I want the truth, Daniel. All of you have been lying, one way or another. So I'm asking you again, who was it? Who tampered with the power, and who killed Dr. Robert? Daniel's face flushed, and for a moment, Michael thought he might break. But instead, Daniel only stared at the floor, his lips trembling. Michael's instincts were telling him that they were close to the truth, that someone in this room knew exactly what had happened. But it was still unclear who that person was. As Michael and Vikram left the interrogation room, a sense of unease settled in the pit of Michael's stomach. There was something about the workers' reactions that didn't sit right with him. The fear was palpable, but there was more to it than just nervousness. There was guilt. The missing footage. The tampered power. The footprints. It was all connected. And the key to the mystery lay in the shadows, just beyond their reach. They're lying, Vikram, Michael said as they walked down the hallway, the weight of the investigation pressing on him. I know it. But there's something bigger at play here. Someone's hiding the truth. Vikram didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. Then it's time to push harder. We'll find out what they're hiding. One way or another. Michael's eyes flashed with determination. We will. And when we do, we'll finally know who killed Dr. Robert, and why. The night air was heavy, and a slight chill had begun to creep in as Detective Michael Rook stood at the edge of the garden, his sharp eyes scanning the area. The mansion, shrouded in the dark, loomed in front of him like a fortress, its windows staring blankly into the void. The entire estate felt like a place caught between secrets and shadows, but tonight, Michael was focused on one thing: the garden. It was Alex, the first worker, who had mentioned hearing a noise in the garden around 2:10 a.m. His claim had been vague, nothing more than a fleeting observation that he had assumed was a stray cat. But Michael didn't buy that for a second. The more he thought about it, the more Alex's words seemed like a clue, albeit an unintentionally revealing one. What if someone had actually been in the garden around that time? What if that figure wasn't a cat at all but a person who had witnessed something, or worse, was involved in something sinister? "Vikram," Michael called out, his voice low and deliberate. Vikram, ever the observant partner, approached from the shadows, his silhouette becoming visible as he walked up the path leading to the garden. "What have you found?" he asked, his tone mirroring the seriousness in Michael's voice. Michael pointed to the ground, his finger tracing the soft earth near the flower beds. "Alex mentioned hearing something out here, but I need to take a closer look. There are more footprints here than I expected." Vikram knelt beside Michael, squinting in the dim light. They both saw the faint depressions in the soil, the imprints left by someone's shoes, someone who had clearly walked around the garden in the early morning hours. "These are fresh," Vikram observed, his finger tracing one of the prints. "But, these marks are different from the ones near the electric meter." Michael frowned. Something about these prints didn't sit right with him. The direction of the marks was all wrong. "Exactly," he muttered. "Look closer, Vikram. The footprints showing someone leaving the house are beneath the ones showing they entered. That doesn't make sense." Vikram raised an eyebrow, a flicker of realization dawning in his eyes. "So, you're saying, someone staged these? They wanted us to think the person came from the garden but was leaving?" Michael nodded slowly, a wave of unease washing over him. "Exactly. These prints were intentionally made to mislead. It's a setup. Someone's trying to make it look like someone entered the garden and left. But the order of the footprints says otherwise." The more they examined the prints, the clearer it became. Someone had planted the evidence to confuse them, to throw them off the scent of the real killer. Michael's thoughts raced. Who would go to such lengths to fabricate a trail? Who had the knowledge, the motive, and the means to deceive them so thoroughly? "We need to trace these back to whoever left them," Michael said, his voice taking on a steely edge. "But we have to be careful. Whoever did this is covering their tracks well. We can't afford to make any mistakes." Vikram stood up, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the garden. "There's something off about this whole situation, Michael. Alex's statement about hearing a noise in the garden, it felt like a distraction. But now, looking at this, I'm thinking maybe he's not involved at all." Michael stood still, deep in thought. "You might be right. Alex might have seen something, but maybe he's not the one behind it. If someone staged these prints, it could be the person who wanted us to think Alex was lying. Or, maybe they wanted us to think Alex was innocent." Back inside the mansion, Michael and Vikram convened to reevaluate their suspects. The discovery in the garden had added another layer of complexity to the case. No longer were they just looking for a killer, they were now dealing with a well-organized deception. Whoever was behind Robert's murder had covered their tracks in ways that were too deliberate to be coincidence. "We're going to have to go back to square one," Michael said, pacing the room. "The garden footprints, the missing CCTV footage, the tampered power, there's a clear pattern here, but we're still not seeing the whole picture." Vikram ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, and we're still left with a few questions. Why would someone go to all this trouble to mislead us? What's the real motive behind Robert's murder?" Michael stopped pacing, turning to face his partner. "It's the project," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Dr. Robert was working on something big, something that could change everything. If someone knew about it, and they were desperate enough to stop him, they would go to any lengths. Vikram nodded thoughtfully. Right. The immortality serum. That's got to be it. Whoever killed Robert didn't just want him dead, they wanted to control what he was working on. Michael's eyes narrowed. And now we have to figure out who would have that much to gain from stopping him. We know his wife was in on it, but was she the only one? Or was there someone else, someone in the house, maybe, who had a vested interest in the project? Later that evening, Michael decided it was time to confront Alex again. The gardener had been adamant about hearing something in the garden, and now Michael had a hunch that there was more to his story than he had initially let on. He could feel the threads of the investigation tightening, and Alex was one of the few people left who could provide any answers. When Alex entered the room, he seemed almost hesitant, his eyes shifting nervously. "Detective Rook, you wanted to see me again?" Michael studied him carefully, his eyes sharp. "Yes, Alex. I want you to tell me everything you know about what happened the night Robert died. You mentioned hearing something in the garden, right? But I've been looking at the footprints, and something doesn't add up. I need to know the truth." Alex swallowed, his hands trembling. "I told you before, I just thought it was a cat, or maybe a raccoon, or something. I wasn't paying much attention. I was just trying to sleep. But then I heard it, and it startled me. So I looked out the window, but I didn't see anyone. I didn't see anything suspicious, Detective." Michael studied him for a moment, weighing his words. "But the footprints in the garden tell a different story, Alex. Someone entered and left the house, and they were careful to cover their tracks. You said you thought you heard something, but did you actually see anything?" Alex shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable. "No. I didn't see anything, but I swear, I heard something. I know I heard something. It wasn't just in my head." Michael leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Alex, we're trying to help you. But if you're hiding something, now's the time to come clean. Whoever did this is still out there, and we need to find them before they hurt anyone else." The silence in the room stretched as Alex's eyes darted around, his mind clearly racing. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he spoke again. "I didn't see anything," he said softly. "But I heard a voice. It wasn't clear, but it sounded like someone was talking. It came from the garden, and then I heard footsteps. But I didn't see anyone. I didn't, ***, his voice trailed off, a look of frustration crossing his face. Michael sat back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. Alex wasn't telling the whole truth, but at least he wasn't completely dismissing what had happened. And that, Michael realized, was a good start. "I believe you heard something, Alex. But I also believe you're holding something back, ***, Michael said quietly. "We'll get to the bottom of this. And when we do, you'll wish you had told me everything from the start." As Alex's interrogation came to an end, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to unraveling the mystery. Whoever was behind Dr. Roberts' murder had been clever, too clever. But now, with the evidence of fake footprints and a new set of questions, Michael was ready to dig deeper. The killer's web of lies was starting to unravel, and he was determined to find out who was pulling the strings. Detective Michael Rook stood in the dimly lit interrogation room, the air heavy with tension. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but the seconds felt like hours. Across from him sat Lisa, the third worker at Dr. Roberts' estate. She had been one of the last people to see Robert alive. Her story had been consistent. She had been in the kitchen making coffee, following Emma's instructions after the first cup had gone bad. But Michael knew something wasn't right. The inconsistencies in her statement had been nagging at him since the beginning, and now, after everything they had uncovered, he was convinced that Lisa was hiding something. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the room, but Michael didn't mind. He was used to the atmosphere, to the weight of an unsolved mystery hanging in the air. But today, he was determined to get the truth from Lisa. She wasn't just another bystander in this case, she was part of the puzzle. And Michael was about to find out just how deep her involvement went. "Lisa," Michael began, his voice low and calm. "I've been going over your statement, and there are a few things that don't add up. You said you were in the kitchen making coffee when the power went out at 2 a.m. You said the lights went off, but when I checked the power grid, there was no outage. That tells me you were lying about something. Now, I want you to tell me the truth." Lisa's eyes flickered, and her fingers tapped nervously on the table. She had been trying to remain composed, but the cracks were starting to show. Michael had seen it before, the moment when a suspect realized their lies were unraveling. "I'm telling the truth," Lisa replied, her voice wavering slightly. "I really was in the kitchen. The lights went out, and it took a while for them to come back on. I swear, I didn't know anything about the murder." Michael leaned forward, his gaze never leaving her face. "Then explain to me why you were paid $7,000 to cut the power at exactly 2 a.m. and restore it at 2:20. You've been lying, Lisa. I know it." Her face went pale. She had been caught. For a moment, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. Then, Lisa's shoulders slumped, and she exhaled a long breath. She finally looked up at Michael, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "I didn't kill him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I know who did." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. "You're telling me you didn't know about the murder, but you were involved in the power outage?" Michael asked, his tone sharp with disbelief. Lisa nodded slowly, her eyes darting around the room as if trying to find a way out. She swallowed hard, struggling to gather her thoughts before she spoke again. "I was paid to do it, okay? Someone who was already inside the house, told me to cut the power. I didn't know who they were at first, but they said they needed the lights to go off for exactly 20 minutes. They said they'd give me $7,000 if I did it. They said no one would know." Michael's mind raced. This was it. The pieces were starting to come together. Someone had planned this. Someone who already had access to the house had orchestrated the power outage to cover their tracks, to make sure no one could see what happened during that critical window of time. But who was it? "Who told you to cut the power, Lisa?" Michael asked, leaning in closer. "Who was it?" Lisa looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She hesitated for a moment, then finally spoke. "I don't know their name, but it was someone from the inside. They had a key, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They told me they were going to take care of something, and that I needed to make sure the lights were off at exactly 2 a.m. and back on at 2:20. I didn't ask any questions. I just did it. It was easy money." Michael's mind was reeling. This was more than just a simple mistake or a distracted worker. This was a calculated move, a part of a larger plan. Lisa wasn't just an innocent bystander, she had been manipulated into creating a distraction while the real crime was being committed. But what bothered Michael the most was that Lisa was still so reluctant to name the person who had paid her. "Why didn't you ask questions, Lisa?" Michael pressed. $7,000 is a lot of money. Were you that desperate? Lisa looked down, unable to meet his gaze. I needed the money. Things haven't been great for me. I've been behind on rent, and I just thought it would be quick and easy. I didn't think it would end like this." Michael's heart hardened. While he understood financial desperation, he couldn't let Lisa off the hook so easily. She had played a part in covering up a murder, she needed to answer for that. But there was still a bigger question that loomed over them all: was Lisa lying about her involvement? Could she really be telling the truth when she said she didn't know about the murder? "You're telling me you had no idea that someone was going to be killed?" Michael asked, his voice skeptical. "You didn't know anything about Dr. Roberts' death?" Lisa shook her head vigorously. "No. I didn't know anything about the murder. I swear, I didn't. I just did what I was told. I didn't ask why, and I didn't want to know. I thought it was just a little favor for someone who needed it, and then I'd get paid. But when I heard about Robert, when I heard what happened to him, she trailed off, her eyes brimming with tears. I didn't know it would end like that. Michael studied her face, looking for any signs of dishonesty. He didn't trust her completely, but there was something in her expression that made him believe she was telling the truth about not knowing the murder would happen. She had been used, manipulated by someone who had been lurking in the shadows, orchestrating the crime. "All right, Lisa," Michael said, his voice hardening once more. "You're not off the hook yet. But if you're telling the truth, then it means the person who killed Robert is still out there. And they used you to create a distraction. I need you to think carefully. Who else was in the house that night? Who would have had a reason to have the power cut off?" Lisa's hands trembled as she wiped away a tear. She seemed to be thinking, her brow furrowed in concentration. After a long pause, she looked up at Michael, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know their name, but I know they had a key. They were calm, collected. They didn't seem like the type to get their hands dirty. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they said they didn't want anyone to get hurt. But they never said anything about a murder. They just said the lights needed to go off. Michael's mind churned. This was a breakthrough. Lisa's testimony confirmed that someone with access to the house had orchestrated the crime, but who was it? Michael could feel the net closing around their suspects, but there was still so much more to uncover. Someone in the house had a motive, and that person was willing to do whatever it took to keep their secret hidden. "All right, Lisa," Michael said, standing up and signaling for Vikram to come into the room. "You're going to stay here for now. We'll keep an eye on you, but I want you to think long and hard about everything you've told me. If there's anything you're holding back, now's the time to come clean." As Lisa was escorted out of the room, Michael turned to Vikram, his thoughts racing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the biggest question remained: who was the mastermind behind Robert's murder? And why were they so desperate to silence the truth? The air in the interrogation room was thick with the tension of an unspoken truth. Detective Michael Rook sat across from Emma, Dr. Robert's wife, his eyes fixed on her. Her gaze, though calm, betrayed the weight of 1,000 questions that she hadn't answered yet. Emma had been cooperative so far, but as the details of her husband's murder unfolded, it seemed as though the more she spoke, the more suspicious things became. Now, with the lab's lock system mentioned, Michael could feel the case shifting into dangerous territory. This could be the key to everything, or the key to something far darker than they had imagined. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, but time seemed to slow as Emma hesitated before speaking again. "You said there was a special lock system on the lab door," Michael began, leaning forward slightly, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. "Tell me more about that. You mentioned there were only 2 keys, one with Robert and one with you." Emma nodded slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. Her lips parted, and Michael could see the hesitation in her eyes. She had always been reserved, but now she was withholding something she didn't want to admit. "Yes," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The lab was very secure. Robert didn't want anyone to have access unless they had a reason. The lock was a digital system, but it required a physical key to bypass. Only Robert and I had the keys. No one else was supposed to have access. I kept mine with me at all times." Michael's mind whirred as he processed this information. A digital lock with physical keys, this wasn't just about security. This was about control. Robert had taken extreme precautions with his research. Only Emma and he had the keys to the lab, which meant if someone wanted access, they had to have one of them. And if the murderer had access, it was likely through Emma or Robert. "And you said you went to the lab at 1:30 a.m., Michael continued, his voice steady, yet filled with a quiet intensity. "Why? What was the purpose of your visit? Emma's gaze flickered, her eyes darting to the floor for a moment before she met Michael's eyes again. The words seemed to catch in her throat as if she had been rehearsing this part of the story in her mind for hours. I went to speak with Robert, she replied, her voice softer now. I had some concerns about his project. He was so absorbed in his work, and I felt like we were drifting apart. I didn't want to disturb him, but I wanted to make sure he was okay, and that we were okay. Michael absorbed her words, watching her carefully. There was a flicker of emotion in Emma's voice, genuine concern, perhaps, but there was also something more. She wasn't just his wife, after all. She was someone intimately connected to the project Robert had been working on, the project that had made him a target. And when you left, you locked the door behind you? Michael asked, his voice calm but firm, as if coaxing out the final, crucial detail. Emma's face stiffened, and she nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. Yes, she said, almost defensively. I made sure to lock the door when I left. I wanted to respect his privacy. He was so focused. I didn't want to disturb him any more than I already had. Michael's mind was racing. It made sense, in a way. Emma had her key, and she had locked the door when she left the lab. That would mean the lab had been secure. But if someone else had entered the lab after she left, how could they have gotten in? It would be nearly impossible without one of the keys. The pieces weren't adding up yet, but this information was a new lead. If Emma's account was truthful, then Robert's killer either had a key or managed to bypass the lock system somehow. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table as he processed what Emma had just said. So, if you locked the door at 1:30 a.m. when you left, then how could anyone have entered the lab after you? No one else had a key, correct? His eyes searched hers, trying to gauge whether she was hiding something. Emma's expression faltered for a split second, and then she straightened, her lips tightening as though bracing for the next round of questions. No one else had a key, she affirmed, her voice firm now, though Michael detected a trace of uncertainty. I made sure of it. Robert had been so secretive about his work, and he was very careful with who had access. It was just the two of us, detective. No one else was supposed to have a key. But someone did, Michael said, his voice low and unwavering. Someone who knew about the lock system, someone who knew that you had a key and used it when you weren't around. Emma's breath caught, her chest rising and falling as if she was struggling to hold back tears. No. I don't think that's possible, ***, she whispered. I never let anyone else near the lab. It was Robert's work. He didn't want anyone to know. Not even his closest colleagues. Michael studied her, trying to determine if she was speaking the truth or if she was simply covering for someone. It was clear she cared deeply about her husband, but how far was she willing to go to protect his legacy? And was it possible that Emma herself had known more about the project than she was letting on? What about the workers? Michael asked, his voice cutting through the tension. You mentioned that there were 3 workers at the house. Could one of them have had access to the lab? Emma's gaze flickered, but she quickly masked her expression. She shook her head vigorously. No, I didn't let them into the lab. They were only there to assist with things around the house. They didn't know about Robert's project. I made sure of it. Michael's instincts were telling him that there was something Emma wasn't saying. She was adamant that no one else knew about Robert's secret project, yet the more he probed, the more it seemed like someone on the inside had known, and perhaps even had a hand in Robert's murder. So, if you went to the lab at 1:30 a.m., and locked the door behind you, how do you explain the fact that Robert was found hanged at 2:30 a.m.? That's only an hour later. If you were the last person with the key, who could have entered in that time frame? Emma's expression faltered once again. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands wringing together as she struggled to answer. Michael could see her mind working overtime, calculating how much to reveal, how much to conceal. I don't know, asterisk asterisk she admitted softly, her voice breaking slightly. I was upset. I was frustrated. I wanted to talk to him about the project, but he was always so distant. I never imagined something like this could happen. I never thought, asterisk asterisk. Her words trailed off, and Michael saw the sorrow in her eyes. But behind that sorrow, there was something else, something darker that still hadn't been revealed. Emma, Michael said gently, his voice almost sympathetic now. You're not telling me everything. If there's something you know, if there's something you're hiding, you need to tell me. Your husband's death was not just a tragedy. It was a murder. And it's possible the killer is still out there. Emma's face crumpled, her shoulders shaking as she finally let the tears fall. I didn't know, Michael, she whispered through her sobs. I didn't know what was happening. Robert was obsessed with his work. And I just wanted to save him. I didn't think it would lead to this. I didn't think, asterisk asterisk. The truth was still just out of reach. Emma had admitted to locking the lab door, but there were still too many questions. Who else had known about Robert's work? How had the killer gained access to the lab? And what role, if any, had Emma played in her husband's untimely death? As Emma wept before him, Michael knew one thing for certain: the key to unlocking this mystery was still hidden in the shadows. And it was up to him to find it, before the killer got away. Detective Michael Rook sat back in his chair, his mind racing as he replayed the details of Emma's story. His eyes narrowed as he focused on the critical point she had just made. Emma had locked the lab door when she left at 1:30 a.m. She had the only other key, aside from Robert's. That meant the killer, whoever they were, must have had Robert's key to get inside after Emma had left. Michael's fingers drummed lightly on the wooden table as he sifted through the possibility in his mind. If Emma locked the door after she left, and no one else had access to a key, then how could anyone have gotten into the lab? The answer, Michael realized, was chilling: the killer had used Robert's key. But there was something even more sinister about this, something that Emma hadn't mentioned, something that made his stomach churn. They erased the evidence. Michael muttered to himself, a sudden realization dawning on him. It made perfect sense. The killer had entered the lab after Emma left, using Robert's key. But if they were smart, they would have known that leaving behind any trace of their presence, fingerprints on the door or the key, would immediately tie them to the crime. So, what did they do? They wiped everything clean. They erased any sign of their presence. And that included Robert's key. Michael's mind raced as he mentally retraced every step, every piece of evidence. The missing CCTV footage. The footprints outside the house that had been planted to mislead. The power outage that never occurred. All of these things now seemed to connect, a web of lies and deception. But there was more to it, more that Emma hadn't said. She had been so insistent on the lab being locked when she left. If she was telling the truth, the killer must have had a key, which meant that someone close to Robert, and to her, had to be involved. The workers? Alex, Daniel, or Lisa. All had seemed to have alibis, but nothing was ever quite as it seemed. Michael's eyes lifted from the table to meet the gaze of Detective Vikram, who was standing by the door, quietly watching him. Vikram had been his partner for years, and he knew when Michael was deep in thought, when he was piecing together the puzzle in his mind. Vikram stepped forward, leaning on the table next to Michael. "What's going through your head, Mike?" Vikram asked, his voice low. Michael leaned back, exhaling slowly as he thought aloud. "It's all pointing to one thing, Vikram. Robert's key. If Emma is right, and I believe she is, then the lab was locked when she left. The only way the killer could have gotten in is if they had Robert's key." He paused, his brow furrowing. "And that means the killer knew Robert. They had to." Vikram nodded, his expression grave. Yeah, no stranger would have had access to that key. So we're looking at someone close to Robert. Someone who knew his schedule, his routine, and how to avoid leaving a trace. Exactly. Michael's voice was firm, his mind already piecing together the next logical step. But it gets worse. The killer wouldn't have just used the key, they would have had to wipe it clean of fingerprints. That means they had to know Robert's movements inside that lab, they had to be methodical. They knew exactly where to touch the key, where not to touch the door. Vikram's eyes narrowed. So the killer's not just smart, they're calculating. They knew exactly what they were doing. Michael gave a short nod. Right. And it's not just the key. It's everything. Look at the CCTV footage. It's missing from 2 to 2:20 a.m. The power goes out for exactly that period, yet the electricity board confirms there was no outage. Whoever killed Robert made sure to disable the cameras and created a power disruption to cover their tracks. He leaned forward, his mind clicking into place. Whoever did this is no amateur. They've covered their tracks meticulously. They're smart. And they knew exactly how to get in, how to kill Robert without leaving a trace, and how to erase any evidence that might tie them to the crime. Vikram glanced at the case file, his fingers tapping against the edge of the folder. What does that tell you about Emma? Is she just a grieving wife, or is she hiding something more? Michael took a moment, his gaze turning inward as he considered the possibility. Emma had been unwavering in her statements, her story about locking the lab door. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. She was deeply involved with Robert's work, his obsession with creating immortality. That project had become a part of their lives, and Emma had been the one person who had constant access to Robert's research. She had a key, yes, but what about the timing? Was she involved more than she admitted? I don't know yet, Michael muttered, his voice heavy. But one thing is certain, someone close to Robert had to have known about his secret project and had access to that lab. And I'm starting to think that the closer we get to the truth, the more we'll uncover about Emma's role in all of this. If the killer wiped the key clean of fingerprints, there's a chance they also tried to cover their tracks with Emma. Vikram took a step back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. You're saying Emma might be hiding something? That maybe she knows more than she's letting on. Michael's eyes locked onto Vikram's, a silent understanding passing between them. I'm saying that this murder is bigger than just a simple killing. This is about a project that was never meant to see the light of day. Whoever killed Robert might not just be after revenge, they could be after the research itself. If they had access to the lab and Robert's key, that means they had access to everything. Michael stood, pacing slowly across the room as the pieces continued to fall into place. We need to look at Robert's research, Vikram. We need to find out who had access to it, and who stood to gain from it. This wasn't just a crime of passion. This was premeditated. This was calculated. Vikram nodded, his expression hardening. All right, Mike. Let's get on it. We'll find the killer. We'll find out who used Robert's key, who had access to that lab, and most importantly, we'll figure out who wanted Robert dead. Michael's mind raced as he considered the next step. The killer was someone close to Robert, someone with knowledge of the lab, the key, and the research. Whoever they were, they had been careful, leaving no room for error. But Michael wasn't going to stop until he had all the answers, until he had the key to the final piece of the puzzle. The investigation had reached a boiling point. After days of sifting through evidence, questioning suspects, and analyzing every small detail, Detective Michael Rook was no closer to the truth. But something had changed. It was as if a shadow had lifted, revealing a crucial piece of the puzzle he had been searching for all along. The workers, Alex, Lisa, and Daniel, had all been interrogated, their alibis seemed airtight, and yet, something about their stories didn't sit right with him. Michael had been re-examining the facts late into the night when it hit him. The details, the inconsistencies, the half-truths they had told. It all pointed to one person. Daniel. The second worker. The one who claimed to have been in the bathroom for an hour with an upset stomach. Michael leaned back in his chair, the faint glow of the desk lamp illuminating his tired eyes. His mind flashed back to Daniel's testimony. The man had seemed so convincing, so sincere when he spoke about his stomach issues. But Michael had learned long ago that people who were too convincing often had something to hide. Daniel's alibi, spending an entire hour in the bathroom, seemed just a little too perfect. And when he paired that with the fact that Daniel had been one of the few who had access to the house, the lab, and possibly the research, the pieces began to fall into place. Vikram, Michael called, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Vikram, who had been reviewing the evidence in the adjacent room, walked over to Michael's desk, his brow furrowing. "What's going on? Have you figured something out?" Michael nodded, his eyes never leaving the case file in front of him. "I think I know who did it. It's Daniel. The second worker." Vikram raised an eyebrow in disbelief. "Daniel? The guy who was in the bathroom the whole time?" Michael sat up, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. "Exactly. And that's what doesn't add up. The timing of his alibi, the lack of evidence to support it, and the fact that he had the perfect opportunity to kill Robert and steal his research." He paused, glancing at the photographs of the crime scene spread across the table. "Remember the power outage? Daniel was the one who set it up with Lisa. But that wasn't just to distract us. It was a cover for something bigger." Vikram's eyes narrowed as he pieced together Michael's reasoning. "You think Daniel killed Robert to steal his immortality research? But why go through all the trouble of faking an alibi and planting evidence? Why not just take the research and leave?" Michael took a deep breath, his voice filled with determination. "Because Daniel didn't just want the research. He wanted to make sure no one else could use it. He wanted to be the only one with access to Robert's discovery. That's why he had to kill Robert, so that he could take the research and use it for himself." Vikram nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious. "All right, let's bring him in. If you're right, this will all come crashing down tonight." It didn't take long for them to find Daniel. When they brought him back into the interrogation room, his face betrayed nothing but nervous tension. He kept his eyes on the floor, his hands clasped tightly together, as if he was trying to hold himself together. Michael sat across from him, the evidence spread out before them, the silence between them heavy. After a moment, Michael spoke, his voice calm but piercing. "Daniel, we need to talk. Your alibi doesn't hold up. You said you were in the bathroom, but we both know that's not true." Daniel's eyes flickered up, and for a split second, Michael saw something that told him Daniel knew the game was up. He tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear he was unraveling. "I don't know what you mean," Daniel said, his voice wavering slightly. Michael leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the table. "I think you do. I've been through everything. The timing doesn't add up. You had the chance. You had the motive." He paused, watching Daniel squirm. "You wanted Robert's research, didn't you? You knew about the Immortality Project, and you thought you could use it to your advantage." Daniel's breath hitched. He shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching. I didn't mean for it to go this far, ***, he whispered, almost as if to himself. But Michael heard it clearly. "You didn't mean for it to go this far?" Michael repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "You killed Robert. You strangled him before hanging him, just so you could take his work." For a moment, Daniel didn't speak. The weight of his guilt hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice hoarse, barely audible. "I had to. I had no choice. Robert's research, it could make me immortal. I thought I could use it to become more than just a worker. I thought I could be the one to unlock it, to make it work. Michael's heart sank. He had known for a while that the secret of immortality was powerful, but hearing Daniel admit it so openly made the whole situation even more chilling. You thought you could become immortal? By killing Robert? Daniel's eyes darted to the floor, ashamed. I didn't mean for him to die, but I needed to get the research. It wasn't just about money or fame. It was about power, about controlling something that could change the world. Michael's voice softened, but his gaze remained steady. And you thought Robert would just hand it over to you? That's why you killed him? Daniel nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. I thought I could convince him. But when he refused, I panicked. I had to make sure no one could stop me. I had to take the research. Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. So you faked the power outage, you planted the footprints, and you created the perfect alibi. All of it was to cover up your crime. And you thought you could get away with it. Daniel's face twisted in anguish. I thought if I did it right, no one would ever suspect me. But you figured it out. You found the key pieces of the puzzle. Michael leaned back, taking a long breath. You're right. I did. But the truth always comes out, Daniel. No matter how carefully you plan it. As Michael and Vikram left the interrogation room, the weight of the case seemed to lift, even as the consequences of Daniel's actions loomed large. Daniel's confession had unraveled the mystery, but the horror of what he had done still lingered. The case was closed. Dr. Robert's groundbreaking research on immortality was lost to the world, destroyed by a man's greed and ambition. Michael couldn't help but wonder how many others might come after that knowledge, how many lives might be lost in the pursuit of such dangerous power. It's over, Mike, Vikram said quietly, his voice somber. We got him. Michael nodded, his gaze distant. Yeah, we did. But there's always someone else out there, someone else willing to cross the line for the sake of power. And I'll be there to stop them when they do. As they left the precinct and the night air cooled their faces, Michael knew this case wasn't truly over. The hunt for the truth never ended, and as long as there were secrets to uncover, he would keep searching.